What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be making this awesome cherry Burl bowl looking thing. I had a lot of fun making it and it's pretty cool, so stick around and I'll show you how I did it. So this is the piece of wood that we're going to be working with today. So I actually play something called airsoft, which is very similar to paintball, if you know what that is. But actually at our airsoft field, I found this the other day, and it is a piece of cherry. The tree was very, very dead. You can see it's all rotted up here. So I just broke this off with permission from the field owner. But this is going to be a really nice piece of cherry burl. So what I'm planning on doing, chopping it here somewhere, and then we're going to flatten one side of this burl so it sits flat on the table, and then we're just going to hollow it out. So you can see I got the ends chopped off of our burl there on the bandsaw, and that really makes this thing look kind of cool. It's just a little ball of cherry. So I'm going to rotate this thing around until we can find kind of a naturally flat side here. So I think it's going to be this side right here. We're going to have to figure out a way to cut this back flat so that way I can mount it to the lathe and start hollowing this thing out. So I'm going to brainstorm on that. All right, so like I just mentioned, we have to get a flat side on this to be the bottom of our bowl. So I just got this thing in my vise. It's too big for any of my power tools. I'm going to use that handsaw back there and just come right down the back side and cut a nice flat spot that we can use for the bottom of our piece. Now we have a very, very nice flat back on our burl. So now what we have to do is get this thing ready to go on the lathe. Okay, so this is my faceplate that I use on the lathe. This is how it mounts onto the wood. So basically you screw the wood onto the faceplate, and then you can see the threads in there. The faceplate screws onto the lathe. So what we're going to do is glue this piece of, I think it's poplar, onto our piece of burl right where we want to mount it to the lathe, and then we can mount our faceplate to that. And that way we don't have to put screws into our nice burl. They go into the faceplate. And for that, I'm going to use Total Boat 2-to-1 epoxy. I like to gob it on there pretty good because I want to make sure there's plenty of epoxy in there. That was probably way overboard. Alright, so I've been busy for a few days. It's actually 4 or 5 days later. This is our cherry burl. We got the waste block on there and it is all dry. So I've already got the holes pre-drilled for our faceplate. So let's go ahead and stick that on there and then we'll pop this thing on the lathe. So you can see we've got this thing mounted on the lathe now, and this is a pretty gnarly burl. We obviously still have the branch on here, so we're going to actually leave that on there. We're not going to turn the outside down. We're just going to hollow out the inside, and we need this thing to dry out. So I'm only going to be hollowing out the majority of the material. I'm not going to go the full way because I want this to dry out. I want this to warp and move and everything, and then once it's dry, we will stick it back on the lathe and clean it up and finish it. Now, this thing is far from a circle, obviously, so I'm going to keep the speed really, really low. We're going to have to turn this at a very low speed the entire time. as you can see, I rough turned this thing, so I got it mostly hollowed all the way out. And that just removed a lot of the material so that it can dry out faster. So it's currently winter, so we're going to go set this down by the wood stove so it can completely dry, get down to about 10%. And then we can fill any cracks or anything with black epoxy. And this thing should be a really, really cool piece. So I got it down on the table here. You can see that we have those branches coming out of the ends, and I absolutely love that. It's a really good representation of what a burl is, actually. And as you can see, we just kind of got that whole middle section hollowed out. Now, I still have the waste block on there. We're going to need that later, so don't take that off quite yet. Well, this has been sitting down by the wood stove for about 2 weeks in our basement drying out, and I can assure you this thing is quite a bit lighter than it was before. It's pretty dry, so what we're going to do is throw this thing back up on the lathe. We're going to finish turning the inside, we're going to sand it up really good, and then we're going to put some finish on this thing, and I think it's going to turn out really, really cool. Alright, so now it is mounted back up. We're going to put this on a slow speed again because obviously it is not even close to being a circle. This thing is going to vibrate like crazy. So we're going to put it on a slow speed. And what we're going to do is just clean up the inside here and just make it a little bit bigger on the inside. And then we are going to do some cleaning up passes just to get it really smooth before we sand. Alright, so now we got to sand this thing, and that's going to be kind of fun because this thing is so squirrely, and it does like to grab sandpaper, so I'm willing to bet that at some point while I'm sanding this thing, it's going to grab the sandpaper and throw it across the room. But we're going to get this thing sanded up really, really smooth. I'm going to start at 80 grit, get this thing sanded. I'm not even going to touch the outside. We're just going to work on that later. I'm just going to be working on the inside right now, so we're going to start at 80 grit and work our way all the way up to 320. Alright, so I finished sanding the entire piece. This thing looks awesome. Some of the grain down in there is just incredible. So I sanded the entire inside up to 320 grit, and then I went over the entire outside with my random orbit sander just to get all the loose bark off and clean it up a little bit. So this thing looks super, super cool. I'm going to go ahead and put a coat of armor seal on this, and that's going to look really awesome. So I just like to put a little puddle down in the bottom and then just work it around. And this stuff's going to soak it up like crazy, so you might have to add more. And then the hardest part's going to be getting down in all the little cracks and crevices in the bark. But we'll get it. We'll get it. Alright, so the finish has been drying for a couple of days now. I've put about 2 coats of finish on this piece. So it's a rustic bowl, so we don't need that many coats. So what we're going to do is mount this back up on the lathe, and then we're going to cut the waste block off of it and work on the bottom. This bowl is pretty much done. So since this is a really, really funky piece and it's so big, I cannot get the parting tool down in there to cut it off. So we're going to go classic. I got the old handsaw here. We are just going to cut it down the back, and then we're going to flatten the bottom later. But I'm going to cut it off using this handsaw, and I'm going to try and keep it as straight as possible. So you can see our little bowl is now parted off the lathe, but the bottom looks pretty rough. So that's where we cut it off with the handsaw. So now we're going to head over to the benchtop belt sander, get this thing flat, and then we're going to smooth it out with the random orbit sander. Guys, thank you so much for watching this week's video. This piece just came out awesome. This thing just looks incredibly cool, and I've made one of these in the past, but I think this one is my favorite just because it's a little bit bigger. Some of the grain in that burl is just truly incredible. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. And remember, I'll be back next week with another awesome video, so make sure you go ahead and get subscribed to the channel. Also, be sure to hit that notification bell so you get notified whenever I post a new video. I'll see you guys next week.